David Ormsby-Gore stood closer to power than almost anyone who never actually held it outright. In the most dangerous week of the Cold War, he sat in the White House Situation Room while the world held its breath, advising a president who trusted him like family. He loved a woman the world already knew as a widow of American myth, and came within inches of marrying her, only to be undone by the very history that had bound them together. His life moved effortlessly between palaces and battlefields, temples in Cambodia and damp Welsh roads, while brilliance and tragic catastrophe braided so tightly they became indistinguishable. This is the story of a man who shaped history from the margins and paid for it privately and brutally. Welcome to Society Mysteries. William David Ormsby-Gore was born on the 20th of May, 1918 in Westminster, London, into a world that assumed continuity would be the order of the day. His father, William Ormsby-Gore, 4th Baron Harlech, was a conservative politician of the old imperial school. His mother, Lady Beatrice Cecil, carried the bloodline of Lord Salisbury, the Victorian Prime Minister. Power, land, and obligation were not abstractions in this household, but physical facts, which were reinforced by estates in Shropshire and Wales and a family culture that treated governance as a form of stewardship rather than vulgar ambition. Yet even before David reached adulthood, the assumption of orderly succession totally collapsed. In 1935, his elder brother Owen, the heir to the title, was killed in a car accident at age 19. The event marked David permanently. From that moment, the future ceased to feel theoretical. It arrived suddenly, violently, and without warning. He was educated along the expected lines of his class, St. Cyprian's, Eton College, then New College, Oxford, but he never quite behaved like a man cushioned by inevitability. At Eton, his reputation was already edged with a mordant wit. When a classmate took his own life, David reportedly muttered, "Please, sir, could it have been the food?" The line, without doubt somewhat cruel, was remembered by classmates less as heartlessness than as a sort of reflexive defence. It's an English thing, really, gallows humour deployed against the intolerable. It was an instinct that would follow him throughout his life, particularly when tragedy became repetitive rather than exceptional. In 1938, at 20, he met a young American who would dominate the rest of his story and the rest of the century at large, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Kennedy's father had just arrived in London as US ambassador. Both men were second sons, fast talkers, and political animals still without portfolios. They bonded instantly, beginning what Ormsby-Gore later described as a, quote, 25-year conversation about power, responsibility, and how easily the world could come apart. The friendship was informal but profound. Unlike most relationships forged in diplomacy, it actually preceded ambition rather than followed along after it. The Second World War cut short any illusions of a leisurely ascent. Ormsby-Gore was commissioned into the Royal Artillery in 1939 and served with Phantom, a legendary reconnaissance unit that worked behind enemy lines and alongside airborne forces. He emerged as a major and had been seasoned by both risk and secrecy. War sharpened him. It taught him restraint under pressure and an instinct for what not to say, qualities that would later prove as important as his eloquence. After the war, he returned briefly to the land, managing family estates with a seriousness that suggested he understood continuity not as inheritance but as labour. Politics, however, soon claimed him. In 1950, he was elected Conservative MP for Oswestry, the family seat, entering Parliament at a moment when Britain was renegotiating its place in the world. Empire was shrinking. Suddenly, alliances were everything for Britain. Ormsby-Gore moved quickly through junior posts, becoming Parliamentary Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office and later Minister of State. He was not flashy. He was precise, rather sardonic, and well-trusted. That trust mattered in 1961, when Kennedy, now president, asked that Ormsby-Gore be appointed British ambassador to the United States. It was an unconventional request. He was not a career diplomat, but both Kennedy and Prime Minister Harold Macmillan understood the stakes. This was not a ceremonial posting. It was a listening post at the edge of catastrophe. A careerist wouldn't do. Someone who knew how to move in silence, how to disguise their crystallizing breath when there was a chill in the air was required. Ormsby-Gore resigned his common seat and arrived in Washington with the authority of someone already inside the president's confidence. What followed was the peak of his public life and the most consequential work he would ever do. In Washington, he was described as our kind of ambassador. He had access that bypassed protocol. He attended family weekends at Hyannisport. He sat in on strategy meetings that excluded cabinet secretaries. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, he was physically present in the Situation Room, urging Kennedy to publish photographic proof of Soviet missiles and to delay direct confrontation at sea. The advice mattered. It bought time. It cooled tempers. History rarely records the man who suggests waiting, but in this case, without him, history might have gone extinct. He was equally influential in the slow, patient work of arms control. Ormsby-Gore and Macmillan pressed Kennedy toward what became the 1963 Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, arguing that restraint, not bravado, was the only adult response to annihilation. Ormsby-Gore's own language captured the stakes with unsettling clarity. Humanity, he warned, risked becoming, quote, the story of an ape playing with a box of matches on a petrol dump. It was not mere rhetoric. It was a diagnosis of the human condition in a neurotic post-war world. The relationship between Kennedy and Macmillan, though productive, was never effortless. It was generational, cultural, and occasionally bruising. Kennedy bristled at any hint of British condescension. Macmillan, steeped in imperial memory, struggled with the pace and theatricality of American power. Ormsby-Gore stood between them as a translator of temperament as much as policy. Kennedy confided frustrations to him that never reached his own advisers. Macmillan relied on him to soften language, to reassure without pleading, to explain American impulsiveness as urgency rather than recklessness. The Skybolt crisis, a shared ballistic missile project that went balls up, and the subsequent Nassau negotiations strained the alliance badly, and Ormsby-Gore privately worried that pride, not ideology, posed the greatest danger to the relationship. His genius lay in reducing disagreement to something survivable. He rarely resolved conflict outright, he prevented it from hardening. In an alliance that increasingly depended on personality rather than parity, that restraint mattered more than any communique. The personal and political were inseparable in Washington. Ormsby-Gore's wife, Sylvia, known as Sissy, was integral to his success. Together, they became the Kennedy family's closest social allies. No other couple spent as much time with John and Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. The intimacy went beyond dinners and receptions. After the assassination in Dallas, Jackie confided to Sissy that had her infant son, Patrick, survived, she would have named her as his godmother. Grief, shared that closely, sometimes rewires relationships. Kennedy's mysterious murder in November 1963 shattered the axis around which Ormsby-Gore's Washington life revolved. He remained ambassador under Lyndon Johnson, but the electricity was gone. Above all, Ormsby-Gore was deeply uneasy about Vietnam, not because he doubted American resolve, but because he doubted the premise. Privately, he questioned whether a war of escalation and metrics could ever produce political legitimacy. Where Kennedy had wrestled with ambiguity, Johnson sought management. The shift troubled him. He felt the special relationship becoming procedural, reduced to alignment rather than dialogue. Access narrowed. Influence became formal. In 1964, his father died, and David inherited the title, becoming the 5th Baron Harlech. But the life of a lord was not one he took to with ease. In fact, Ormsby-Gore's later estrangement from British politics was not simply grief-driven withdrawal. It reflected a deeper identity crisis. He belonged to a class trained to govern through continuity, discretion, and inherited obligation, yet he lived to see those assumptions collapse. When he entered the House of Lords after inheriting the title, he found the chamber curiously hollow. Debate felt performative and untethered from consequence. Power now lay elsewhere, in the media, in executive offices, in public spectacle. Ormsby-Gore had never enjoyed rhetoric for its own sake, and the toothless lords offered little of the quiet effectiveness he prized. He resigned his leadership role quickly, almost with relief. This was not petulance, but recognition. This was not what he had been educated for. Whatever that was, it was going extinct. The skills that had made him indispensable in Washington, listening, calibrating, restraining, had limited purchase in a system increasingly suspicious of unaccountable authority. Even his aristocratic identity felt unstable. His children moved fluently through a culture that rejected deference. He remained anchored to a belief in stewardship without audience. The result was a man historically misaligned, too modern for inherited power, too reticent for democratic theatre. In 1965, he returned to Britain, decorated, admired, and yet inwardly unmoored. The descent that followed was not immediate, but it was bizarrely relentless. David became one of those men who seems to become a bored god's plaything, remorselessly taunted like a cat with a woodland creature in its paws. In May 1967, Sylvia was killed in a head-on car collision in rural Shropshire. Ormsby-Gore was 49, suddenly widowed, with 5 children and no emotional ballast. The symmetry of loss, Jack, then Sylvia, was unbearable. He resigned his remaining political posts and retreated briefly from public life. It was in this raw interval that his relationship with Jacqueline Kennedy changed shape. Friendship, already deepened by shared mourning, edged towards something riskier. In late 1967, the two travelled together to Cambodia, touring Angkor Wat in near silence, watched by a fascinated press. Officially, it was cultural tourism. Unofficially, it was two people testing whether their proximity could still the noise of dark memories. Photographs of them holding hands circulated. Rumours followed in the press. Both denied an affair, and both were telling the truth in the narrow sense. The bond was emotional before it was physical. By early 1968, Ormsby-Gore proposed marriage. The gesture was earnest, even old-fashioned. Jackie considered it seriously. In letters that would remain hidden for decades, she acknowledged the love between them. And yet, she refused him. She could not, she wrote, build a future with someone who embodied the very world of pain she was trying to escape. She chose distance over continuity, marrying Aristotle Onassis later that year. Ormsby-Gore was devastated. In drafts never sent, he wrote of plans reduced to, quote, irrelevant trash within hours. It was the most intimate rejection of his life, and it broke something that never fully healed. Publicly, he moved on. In 1969, he married Pamela Collin, an American magazine editor, nearly 3 decades his junior. The match surprised society and briefly revived him. He poured his energies into new arenas. He chaired Harlech Television and launched a Welsh ITV franchise, with backing from friends like Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. He even served as Britain's chief film censor for 2 decades, with a liberal and largely uncontroversial hand. He became a vocal advocate for European integration at a time the Conservative Party was drifting inward. He looked busy, he was functional, but he was not at peace. The family tragedies then resumed. By the mid-1970s, David Ormsby-Gore's public life had narrowed to a thin corridor of obligations, while his private life widened into something almost unmanageable. In 1974, his eldest son Julian died from a gunshot wound in what was ruled an apparent suicide. The death of Julian struck him with a force that friends later said that he never recovered from. Julian had been handsome, restless and unmoored, a young man who had tried on the uniforms of his class without ever finding one that fit. Educated at Eton and trained as a guards officer, he drifted instead into modelling and the loose glamour of London's fashion world, a trajectory that baffled and worried his father. What remained was the knowledge that the son he had quietly groomed as heir was gone, and that whatever protective authority aristocracy once promised had proven useless. From that point on, grief was no longer episodic, it was cumulative. 2 of his daughters were already living lives that pulled them far from the world he understood. Jane, once photographed as a symbol of aristocratic modernity, moved easily through the swinging London of boutiques, artists and musicians. It has been alleged that the Rolling Stones song Lady Jane was written for her. Alice, more vulnerable and intense, became entangled with the music scene at its most destructive. She lived for years with Eric Clapton, entering adulthood inside a culture that romanticized excess while quietly consuming those least equipped to survive it. Ormsby-Gore did not interfere publicly. He had never believed authority worked that way. His instinct, inherited and honed, was to give space and hope that judgment would follow experience. In Alice's case, it never quite did. These were not scandals in the political sense. No inquiries followed. No reputations collapsed overnight. But taken together, Julian's death, Alice's addiction, Jane's brushes with police, Victoria's later struggles, they created a portrait of a family stretched thin by the very freedoms of the age Ormsby-Gore had helped usher in. The post-war world he believed in, rational, restrained, guided by responsible elites, had given way to something louder and more dangerous, and it had taken his children with it. Furthermore, the pattern of cars, drugs and sudden endings fed a mythology of curse. Ormsby-Gore never indulged it publicly. Privately, it hollowed him, and he must have started to believe it. Professionally, he remained outwardly composed. As chairman of Harlech Television, he helped establish a durable regional broadcaster, one that balanced Welsh cultural identity with the commercial realities of modern media. His tenure as head of film censorship was marked by pragmatism rather than dogma. He approved controversial films with minimal cuts, understanding that prohibition rarely eliminated desire and often amplified it. He was, in this sense, a liberal conservative in the truest meaning of the term, suspicious of both repression and chaos, committed to moderation even as the centre struggled to hold. Yet even these roles gradually receded. By the early 1980s, Ormsby-Gore was no longer a man shaping institutions so much as maintaining them. His second marriage had quietly failed. Pamela Collin, much younger and American, belonged to a future-oriented world he could admire but not inhabit. They separated without public bitterness, another ending that arrived without drama but left residue. He divided his time between London and his Welsh estate, Glen Ciwak, where the landscape offered a kind of continuity the rest of his life lacked. Those who saw him in his final years described a man who remained charming, sharply intelligent and impeccably mannered, but also solitary. He drove himself long distances, often fast, as if movement itself offered temporary relief from stillness. The irony that cars had already taken his brother and his first wife was not lost on those who knew him. He seemed aware of it himself, as though speed were both defiance and surrender. That pattern ended as it had begun. On the night of 25th of January, 1985, he crashed on a dark Shropshire road, an accident that was somehow inevitable, fated and final damning evidence of the family anathema inflicted by some unnamed malevolence. He died the next morning, 66 years old. The symmetry was brutal. Another Ormsby-Gore lost to the road, another abrupt severing of continuity. At his funeral in a small Welsh church, the presence of Jackie Onassis, alongside members of the Kennedy family, transformed a local farewell into something quietly transatlantic. It was a final acknowledgement of a life entwined with hers, even in refusal. In the years since, David Ormsby-Gore has existed largely as a footnote. He was JFK's friend, Jackie's almost a husband. That shorthand misses the point. His true legacy lies in influence exercised without an ego, in a certain restraint practiced when spectacle might have been easier and legacy ensuring, in the unseen labour of preventing total nuclear disaster. He shaped moments rather than monuments. He was one of the men who made sure we are still here, these apes still playing around with matches. When Jackie's letters were finally discovered and auctioned decades later, they revealed not scandal, but depth. Here were two adults refusing to lie to themselves about what love could and could not repair. It is an ending as honest as any engineered in politics. Ormsby-Gore's life offers no simple moral. It suggests instead that proximity to power always demands a private cost, that history is often steered by those who never claim credit, and that some losses remain immune to intellect, charm, and service alike. He was, above all, a man who understood how fragile the world was, and paid for that understanding in full. His legacy, then, is not monumental. There are no statues. There is no doctrine bearing his name. What remains instead is an example of how influence can be exercised without spectacle, of how friendship can matter in geopolitics, of how tragedy does not automatically ennoble, but can deepen perception. David Ormsby-Gore lived close enough to history to touch it, and far enough from it to see its damage clearly. That tension defined him to the end. All right, a very interesting figure, and one who is not often discussed. I hope you enjoyed this look at one of the quiet players of the 20th century. I've been Chester. Many thanks for listening. If you'd like to support Society Mysteries and get early access to every video, I now have a members area which you can access by clicking join below this video. See you next time.